Hello everyone and welcome back to the React on Rails tutorial series. In this one we're going to be setting up our Vite app, but first we want to sort of change how our Rails API's routes are working. Because as we go into the Vite app, we're going to be communicating with the Rails API. We're going to want this to be versioned so that if we do any future modifications, we have a bit of an easier time. To do this though, we're going to start in our GitHub issues. To do this, though, we're going to start in our GitHub app so that we can actually... To do this, though, we're going to want to start in our GitHub repository. The reason why is we want to create like an issue that just says we're going to be working on this because we're trying to do this properly so that you get a better idea of what this workflow is like. So we'll come over to our code or to our repo. We'll go over to issues, click create new issue. And then here we'll say like, I don't know, set up Vite React app. And then in here we can add a checkbox list of things we want to accomplish. So we'll say like create Vite app and then refactor API routes to use /API/v1 routing type stuff. And then we can just click submit new issue. So it's not like the best issue that's ever been written, but this allows us to create a branch for it by clicking on this button under development over here. We can go ahead and create this, click create branch. It'll then give us this code that we can copy. And then we can come over into our terminal in the root of our Rails app and paste this in. And this should move us over to a different branch. We can now do a git status where we hopefully have no changes, and then we can go ahead and get started. So let's start by taking a look at our Rails app as it is right now. We'll come over to localhost port 3000. You can see we're writing Ruby on Rails. We can then go over to /posts, which has our posts in it with the newest one at the top. So that's fine. But there's a couple things that we want to deal with here. If you haven't used extensions before for your development, there's one called the JSON formatter. You can probably find it if you Google for it. If you enable that one and then you come over here to your applications, you can actually see the JSON in a much better format. For the parsed, you can still look at it raw, but in the parsed version, it's just a lot easier to read. Makes it a lot better for videos as well. The next thing I want to do is let's change this from going to /posts to like /API/v1. So we'll come in here, we'll create a comment first. Say, I don't know, like API routes should be in /API/v1. The reason why we do this, again, if you decide that you want to, let's say, rename your tweets to posts, you don't want to break the API for everyone else. That would make you a questionable developer. So you can just say, okay, now we have a v2 of our API, and then we comment out the resources for the posts, and then we put in one for the tweets, for example. But we want to do something like a namespace, right, for our API, and then we want to do a namespace for our v1. We can then tab over the posts, and we can do an end and an end right here. So let's save this, and then let's try to go to /posts, for example. That's not going to work. What we have to do now is go to /API/v1/posts. This also isn't going to work, though, because it has an uninitialized constant API. The reason for that is up here in our app, we have our controllers, we have our post controller, but we have to actually create a new folder here, call it API. And then in our API folder, we have to create a new one, call it V1. And then in there, we want to drag in our post controller. If we do this and we refresh, you'll see we still get this issue. The reason is, although we've moved this into the proper folder structure, we still only have a class of post controller here. We actually need to do a API v1 for the post controller. And that's actually going to allow us to visit our posts again. This is a little bit deceptive because usually when you do this, you're going to run into an issue with like trying to redirect to the posts after you create them. You can get some wonky behavior. So you are going to want to be careful with how some of these things are handled. But I think for right now, this should be good enough. We can go to like post/1. Everything should work out of the box. So let's go ahead and let's create our Vite app. But before we do that, let's do a git status. We can see we've changed a couple of things here. Let's do git add dot, git commit. And then you can either do a --m with your message right here, or we can just do it like this. And we just have to name, give this commit a title. So we'll say like change routes to use /API/v1. This fix probably breaks stuff though. Again, write better commit messages than I do. But what you can do now is hit Control O, enter, and then Control X, and you can exit out of there. So now you have that commit. You can do a git push this up, and then at any point you can come over to GitHub if you need to, go over to your code or whatever repository you're using, And then we can see we have some changes here for this branch. So this branch is now up and running. Super cool stuff. Let's go ahead and let's create this Vite app. To do that, we're going to do an npm create Vite at latest. This is going to allow us to create our actual project. I'm going to name my entire front end just the client. You can name it like front end, you can name it Vite, you can name it React, you can name it, you know, if it's a dog app, you can name it the kennel, I don't know. Go ahead, create client. Come down here, we'll do a React app, although you have other options. And then I'm going to go with JavaScript. You can go with TypeScript, but you're going to have to convert all of the JS that I use into TS, which can be kind of a pain. So I'm just going to go with JavaScript for now. And then the last thing I want to do here is run a Rails S to start this specific server. And then over here, I'm going to go ahead and cd out of here. And we're just going to do a, from the root of our application, I'm going to cd into the client directory. And then in here, I'm going to run a npm install because there's going to be some initial dependencies that get installed. And then we can come over here to our side panel and we can see that we now have a client directory. This comes with its own gitignore, which should add the node modules to the gitignore list by default so that we don't add all of our node modules into our GitHub repo. But there's a couple things we have to set up in here. And the whole reason why we did the API routing in this video is because I want to do a npm install for .env. Because I want to actually create a .env file here in the root of our client app. So I'm going to say this is a .env.development, for example. And in here, because we're using Vite, I want to do a Vite underscore as the prefix for this environment variable. And I just want to call this the API URL. And then in here, I want to say localhost port 3000 /API/v1/posts. So now anytime that I need to access the API in our application here in our client, like I need to talk to the Rails app, I'm just going to grab this environment variable so that I only have to change this in one place. And then in the future, I can create like a .env.production, for example, and then I can just put in the production URL in there so that it works just fine in the production environments. If you need to, you can come into your .gitignore at the bottom here, say like don't push up env files, you dummy, right? And then in here we can just do a .env, and we can add a .env.development, for example. And after we save this, we'll see that this .env file becomes gray in our VS Code because it's no longer being tracked by Git. Of course, right now we only have our / because our entire client directory isn't being tracked, but this should be good enough for now. Let's go ahead and let's do an npm run dev to start our server. And we can go over to this URL in our browser here, and we can see at port 5173, we are running Vite plus React. So let's just start this video by creating like our post index page, for example. To do that, we can come over to client src, and then in our src, we have this app.jsx. If you're not familiar, this is like your main app file right here. So we can get rid of all of this, and we'll just leave it as a blank thing for right now with this fragment in it. Go ahead and save this, refresh, and now you won't see anything on the page. If we put the word test in here though, you'll see test immediately appears. We have that cool hot reloading that comes with React. You'll love to see it. Let's get rid of both of these imports here because we're not using them. And we're also not using this count, so we can get rid of that as well. Now for how we're going to be doing this, there's a couple things we have to do actually. The first one is we probably want to create like our router or maybe our nav bar. I think a good place to start though is to just create this post index page. And then we can worry about how we want to structure the rest of the React app. So to do this, I'm just going to say this has an H1, or this is like the React on Rails blog. And then we can do a p tag below that just says find this application layout in client /src/app.jsx. Just so if you need to, when you're looking at like the GitHub repo, you can realize sort of where this stuff is coming from. That gives us the basics here. Let's get rid of this use state. And now we can see this is being displayed on the page. So let's go ahead after we do all of this and let's render our first component. What I want to call this component is, it's kind of just a post list. So let's just go with that. We'll say this is the posts list like that. We can save this. You'll see that nothing happens now. And the reason is we don't have this post list in our app yet, right? Like we haven't created this. So we're getting a not defined error. So let's start by defining it. Now there's a couple ways you can do this in your SRC. If you've ever used React before, there's a couple different ways people structure this. One might be you have like a components directory and you create all of your components in here. Another way people like to do this is you have like a features directory. And then in your features, you might have like your posts feature, you might have like a car feature, et cetera, et cetera. And then you put like your posts list in there and like the test for that post list. So I think that kind of makes sense. So we're going to go with that. I'll go into the posts and I'll say we have a posts or a post list. Yeah, it's plural, posts list dot JSX. I think it's list though is how I had this. And let's come over here and let's just say this is our posts plural list singular. Good God, what a name. Now, with this, we want to import it, right? So in our app.jsx, we have to actually say, hey, you have this thing, you need to use it. To do that, we can come in here and we can say import, and then whatever we want to call this. So this is going to be like our posts list, and this is going to come from our /features/posts/posts list. That'll work. We can now use it here. We won't hopefully get that error anymore, but now we're getting a different one, which says it doesn't provide an export name default. So let's come over to the component now, and let's actually create this component. The export default is just saying like at the bottom of our page, we have to export something like this. But if we just export that, that's still not defined, right? So we can leave this down here, but we actually have to tell it, look, you have a function, it's called posts list, and it does some stuff. And then you're going to export this. Now, right now, it's really not showing anything, but we can come in here and we can do a return. And in our return, we can do some parentheses. And then in here, we can do our fragments, just like before. And then in here, we can say posts list, right? And now we can see that's being displayed on the page. So we just have to replace this with the ability to talk to the API, grab all the posts, iterate through all the posts, list them all off in a cool and unique way, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of a lot to deal with. We could make it a little bit easier by, abstracting some of this logic. But for right now, I think it's cool if we just go through and we set this up in kind of an efficient way that we can later clean up. So to do that, we're going to need to fetch some posts whenever we need to. So in our post list, we're going to have to do something like, I don't know, fetch posts from the API, right? And to do that, we're going to need to have access to our API URL comes from the .env.development file, right? So we have to import that. We also have to import React, but we want to, right now, grab this .env.development file. How are we going to access it, though? Well, in the root of our source right here, we're going to right-click New File. We're going to call this like constants.js. And in our constants.js, we want to export a const called API URL, which is going to be equal to a quick little check that says, what is our environment right now? If it's equal to, let's say, like test, then we want to have a mocked URL. So we'll say this is like http:// mocked API URL. So it's not real, right? If we're testing, we're not using a real URL. If we're not in test, we're probably in development or production, in which case we want to grab the import.meta.env.vite API URL, just like this, which will depend based on which environment we're running in. So we can come over here, we can stop our server, we can run our server again, we can refresh our server, and that should be working fine. We can come in here and we can import this API URL to wherever we need to use it in. So this might be imported into like your services, for example. To do that, we have to use some braces. We'll say this is our API URL, and then we're going to say we're importing this from, I think it's .. constants, or maybe it's double .. I think. Something like that, which should now import it. It's going to give me an error saying this isn't used, but that should be fine, hopefully. Now let's go ahead and let's do some of this logic. So in our posts list here, we're going to need to have a post and set post, which is using useState, which means besides importing React, we also need to import useState. And I mean, I'll just spoil it right now, we're also using useEffect. So we can grab both of those. We have our posts here. This is where we're going to be storing them. Additionally, if you want to, you can set a loading or an error state if you need to. Just make sure that your loading is set to true initially and your error state is set to null. And then in here, we can say, all right, we have a return. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of this and let's reformat this a bit. Instead of just using these fragments, I want to use a div, and then I'm going to close it. In this div, I want to do a quick little posts, which is coming from this post right here, dot map, and then we want to map each post. The reason why we do this map is, think of it like a for each loop if you want to. Basically, we're going to iterate through each of the posts, and for each of the posts, we're going to do something in here. So we're going to start with a div, which has a key equal to the post.id, and then we'll give it a class name equal to post-container. So this is going to be our overall container div, right? So around each of our posts, we're going to have a container that wraps around it, and then in there we'll have a h2, and then in this h2, for now, we'll just do a post.title. We'll clean this up later. And then after the post.title, we want to have another one that is like the, we can just do the post.body if we need to. We'll do that down here in like a p tag, right? Not that, we'll do that. And then we can, we can move this up like that. Save all of this. Now, by doing this, you'll notice that nothing really happens, right? So the reason why is our posts are currently empty. It's just an empty array, which means this map isn't actually doing anything. So the first thing we have to actually do here is we have to say, all right, let's grab these posts from our API. So we're going to do a use effect, which has a bit of a weird syntax if you've never used it before. But effectively what this does is it's going to run on your initial load. It'll probably do a double render. You'll probably get a whole bunch of headaches here until eventually you find a way to only run this function once. And the easiest way to do that is going to be some kind of like async function that you're going to run. Now this async function doesn't need to do a lot. Effectively, all you need to do is say this is your async function. It's going to be called, I think I called it like load posts. And then for this load posts, you're going to do a try and a catch block. And this is something we're going to abstract out into a post service in the future. But for right now, really the only thing we want to do is say this is a const response, which is going to go to await, fetch, and then this is just going to be API URL. We don't need the rest of this now. So we're just going to the API URL right here. After the API URL, we check if the response is okay. If it is, we set some JSON and we set the post to be that JSON. If the response isn't okay, we'll throw the response, or you can, console.warn it, do something with it. It really depends on how you want to handle this. I'm not going to be covering error handling right now. So for right now, we'll just go with what GitHub Copilot suggested. If there's an error during the try catch, it'll say, hey, an error occurred, console log it. And then finally, it'll set loading to false because we finished with this initial load. So this is all fine and dandy. We have this function here. But we do need to actually use this. So how do we use it? Well, right here, we can just call load posts after we've defined it. So we define it and then we use it. You can save this, come over here and refresh. And now if we come over to our Rails app, every time we refresh, you can see here, it started get post, does some processing, does the get for /API/v1, whatever. So all of that's working just fine. The issue is nothing seems to be happening in our application. It's because in this return right here, this actually needs to be a parenthesis instead of this brace. I went with the old double brace there, which is unfortunately not the correct syntax. And then if we do this, we should be good to come over here and refresh. And now we should see all of our posts being iterated through. Now, of course, we don't have any links right now, but we are just grabbing these through our Rails API. So if we stop our Rails server, go to a Rails C and do a post.create, we can do a title of hello world and a body of it's me. And then we can go ahead and close this, hit enter. This will create it. And now we can hit Control D to exit out and run a Rails S again to restart our server. And now if we refresh our React app, we'll see that first little hello world appearing. So we can see that that's working. But I think this is a good place to stop for this video because we have something here and it gives us a lot of like increased flexibility for what we want to refactor later. So let's go ahead and let's do a get status to see what we've changed, which is we've added our client app. So let's do a get add dot git commit -m. I'll just do a commit message this time and I'll say added the Vite React client app. We can go ahead and check our list here. You can see there's nothing too incriminating that was added. So let's go ahead and let's do a git push to push this up. And now we can come over to our GitHub repo here, refresh the page. We can see we have these changes here. So let's go ahead and let's compare in pull request. We have this, and we'll just say this needs to address, or we'll say this addresses a previous issue, which is issue number 1, set up the Vite React app. So let's go ahead and let's create this. And then after we've done this, we can come over to the actual issue. We can see we have both of these options here to check these off if we want to. There is a way to automate this, but for right now, we'll just leave it like this. And then we'll say, let's go ahead and let's merge this pull request because I think it's addressed all of the things we want it to. And as soon as we merge this pull request, so we say address is number 1, if we come over here, we can now see that our issue has also been closed, which we covered in the Git tutorial the other day, but I thought it'd be cool to just touch on this again. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. In the next one, we'll hopefully go ahead and add some of the other functionality and maybe think about how we want to refactor this, because adding these API calls into each of our components will of course be cumbersome to say the least as the application scales. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.